Hey, St. John, this is Pastor Adam. I am not Deaconess Dahlia, but we are here today for the Post-Sermon Podcast, and I have with me Vicar Alan. Vicar, how you doing?
I'm doing good. How are you?
I'm doing well, and we are here to talk about your sermon from this past Sunday, and it came from the Gospel of Luke, and specifically the parable of the prodigal son. Vicar, can you tell us a little bit about that text?
It's a famous text. A lot of people know about it. It's about the youngest son taking his share of the property and leaving the father. And of course, what's unique about this is the father does not get to see his son do what we get to read, what he's doing, how he's squandering in the world, giving all his money away. And while he's in that sin, while he's lost in the world, he comes to himself, and he comes to his senses and realizes the blessing he had of being back home. So when he returns back home, he confesses that he has sinned against his father and in heaven, and yet the father just embraces him and welcomes him back home. And so this beautiful text of the son returning back home, relating it back to us, how we at times get caught up in the world and all the different things, and how God welcomes us back home.
All right, and that's definitely the direction you took in the sermon. And I think just as a side note, you mentioned that the sermon's about the younger son. I mean, I've heard sermons that are about the older son. I've heard sermons that are about the father, and there's so much you can do with this parable that it's good that we return to this reading so regularly in the church here. Now, in your sermon today, you kind of had a modern day sort of story of someone who goes away, right? He goes to another country and develops a new life, and he returns home to his mother eventually. And you had that turn later in the sermon. But you also bring in a hymn that you would sing in your congregation growing up. Can you tell us a little bit about that hymn?
Yeah, growing up, I attended an Indian worship service, and so we used to sing a lot of traditional Indian hymns. And so one of the hymns we would sing, especially whenever the gospel was read about the parable of the prodigal son, was a hymn about that. What's so unique about that hymn, and this is what I was kind of meditating on as I was developing the sermon, was that the hymn takes the perspective of the father, which is interesting how the whole church is singing from the perspective of the father. And the hymn is about the father standing, watching his son leave. He does not get to see his son do all the things he does. And the father is simply saying, why are you getting lost in the crowd of the world? Come back home, son, come back home. And I just wanted to make that just relatable to us, and how, looking from the father's perspective, how God welcomes us back home, how the father welcomes us back home.
Yeah, absolutely. And we were talking a little bit before the podcast, and you got some folks asking, why didn't we get to hear the hymn, or why didn't you sing it during the service? Do you have any thought about? It's a deliberate choice to make with the sermon, and I think it's the right one. But can you kind of share why not have the music, or why not? We hear Vicar Alan sing in Hindi for a little bit.
Yeah, I would have loved to sing the song for everyone, but of course I wanted us to focus on the words, and the words, whether it's sung in Hindi or in English or whatever, I just wanted us to focus on the words and how the words are so true and how it relates to us, whether it's sung in Hindi or in English. The words are true, how God the Father calls us and welcomes us back home.
Yeah, and I love that idea that no matter where you are in the church, this is the hope of the gospel, our God who brings us back to himself, no matter what language or in what tune we sing and hear these words in. All right, well, let's just run through a few of these questions that we usually do. Let's see here. What was your central teaching in the sermon?
The central teaching was that God brings us back home. He is the one that calls us back and unites us back home. And how the truth is, we do go out into the world. We are living in different places. We're enduring many different things, and we get caught up in that. And yet God still remains true to who he is. He's the one that brings us back, strengthens our faith in times when we become weak in our faith, and gives us the promise that we're not only called back to his holy house today, but the eternal life to come to be with him.
Yeah, and especially in the parable, it's so important to see the father's actions. That the father is really the one that brings his son home. We don't bring ourselves back to God; he brings us to Himself always. And then thinking about not only seeing what God is doing as you're preaching, how do you intend to benefit your hearers in their faith or life?
Yeah, the benefit of the hearers was, as you just mentioned, it's not up to us. The benefit was to remind all people that since we are the children of God, we have a God that's always present with us, reminding us how He is the one that has brought us back through His Son Jesus, who, in the story in the parable, it says the Father robed His Son, with the most expensive robe. We are robed. With the righteousness of Christ, of what Christ has done for us. And so the benefit for us is that we wear the robe of His righteousness. We wear the robe of what Christ has done on the cross. And so we are, wherever we are in the world, God is always present with us, calling us, welcoming us back.
Since you mentioned Jesus, as we work closer to how you got to Jesus in the sermon, when we think about the problem your sermons ought to identify, what's the issue before us in your preaching this week?
Yeah, going off of the story, as I mentioned about the man who had went back to Asia, what we get to see is because we are dealing or so focused with ourselves, maybe at times we become unintentionally selfish. We start to focus on our things and what matters to us. And what that does is it even draws us away from the faith. We get so unintentionally selfish with ourselves that we go away from God. We get separated from God in focusing on those things. And yet, even in our unintentional selfishness, the Father welcomes us back. Whenever we step back into church, at the door, the Father embraces us and welcomes us back to Himself. And takes away that sin, and recenters us and increases our faith in Him.
Yeah, and thinking about that idea of when we think of our selfishness, and as you mentioned, unintentional selfishness, the good news for us is the Father brings us back. The Father welcomes us back in. The Father brings us to Himself. But how you got to Jesus sounds a little bit differently. How did you express Jesus in the sermon this week?
Yeah, the Father does that for us. And yet the Father is the one that did not welcome back His Son. We get to read, the Father was there during Jesus' baptism. The Father was there at the Transfiguration. This is my Son, listen to Him. But what about at the cross? We get to hear the words of Jesus where He says, my God, why have you forsaken me? Because Jesus was the one that was bringing us back to Himself. He was the one that was creating a way for us to be welcomed back home. And so Jesus did all that and showed to us how we are going to be welcomed back, how Jesus is the one that resurrected. He left that empty tomb, and how Jesus, how He ascended into heaven and was welcomed by the Father because Jesus had did that for us. How He was welcomed back and sits and reigns at the right hand of the Father, how we will one day join with them.
Yeah, and I'm just thinking about the modern hymn, How Deep the Father's Love for Us. You get that line that the Father turns His face away. And part of the mystery of the gospel, the mystery of the Godhead, of Father, Son, and Spirit at work to save us. And yet it is there where we see that God is bringing us to Himself by pouring out His wrath on His Son who has become sin for us, that we might become the righteousness of God. And it's a stunning thing to see the parable and to see how this relates to us in God bringing us to Himself. Well, Vicar, let's think about this. Is there anything else to bring up in the sermon? What about a challenge in the process for you this past week?
Yeah, the challenging part was, how do I describe the hymn for everyone? Of course, it was that language barrier. Should I sing it? Should I not? That was always in the discussion. But of course, the words is what mattered, so I wanted to share that. And also just kind of bringing out that story of the man who had left. I got to meet him sometime when I was back in New York, and he shared that story with me. And that story just kind of stayed with me, and it stayed with, these are real things that people experience in their life, just real stories of faithful people, how God calls them back. And I just wanted to share that story with all of us, and I thought it was an appropriate place to share that story as we were meditating on this text.
All right. Well, Vicar, thanks for sharing the word with us this past week. I think we're going to call it a podcast episode here, and I lost the script that Deaconess left for me to read. So if you have questions on the sermons, submit them. What is it? podcast@stjohndublin.org. There'll be a link to the sermon in the show notes. Thanks all. You have a good one.
Take care. Bye-bye.